Good morning. If you're a regular attender here, you realize I'm not Andy. And if you're new, you don't know any different. So it's great. Andy is helping lead a trip down to Memphis this week. They're doing a mission trip down there and with the church down there. And so we want to keep them in our prayers. This week is they're down there. My name is Osgood. I'm the connections pastor here. My family and I have been here a total of 5 months, and they thought it was a good idea to put me on stage. So we'll see. No, I am super excited about what God is doing here at South Rock, and just where I see God taking our church in the future and how we can impact our community. And so excited to be here and excited for today and be able to bring the word. And so I just want to just invite God to be in this space this morning. That it's not me, it's not any of us, but it's really God's presence with us. Can we do that? Dear Father, we just thank you for today. God, we thank you for who you are. We thank you for your bigness, your goodness. We thank you that you're a God that puts his presence with us. So God, we just ask for you to be in this space, that God, you would challenge us and that you would change our hearts today. But ultimately, God, that you would be lifted up and you would be glorified. It's just your name we pray. Amen. Is there a moment in your life that you never want to forget? Is there a moment in your life you never want to forget? Maybe it was something special that someone did for you that you just never want to forget that moment. Maybe it was when you got married. This is the moment. Husbands, start shaking your head. Yeah, that was never want to forget that, right? Man, you guys weren't doing it. That's okay. Well, all right. We see how this is going to go. So, no. Maybe it was when you heard the heartbeat for your child the first time. Or maybe when you held your kids for the first time. I know for me, those are some of the moments I never really want to forget. Just being in the hospital, holding my sons for the very first time. Maybe it was some traumatic event in your life that you never really want to forget because it was a moment that it changed your life forever. And maybe it was changed it in a good way, and you never want to forget that moment and what happened. Maybe it was a moment of you had an addiction or you had a habit, and it was a moment that you changed that, and you go, man, I never want to forget where I was and where I am now. What is it that you never want to forget? I remember when I was in my late 20s, I gained about 50 pounds, and it was literally on Sunday morning, I ate 3,000 calories in donuts every Sunday morning. I kid you not. Don't judge me. If you had the opportunity, you would be doing it too. I'd be there all morning, multiple services, and I just, every time I saw a donut, I put it down. And I was 20-something. I can eat whatever I want and not gain weight, right? But no, that's not true at all. And so I gained over the course of a year, I literally gained 1 pound every week from donuts. And so I gained 50 pounds, and I went on a bike ride, and it was nothing too crazy, too strenuous, just a simple old bike ride. And I developed this cough afterwards, and it just wouldn't go away. I thought it was allergies at first, and it went on for several weeks, and I was just coughing a lot. Then I went into summer camps, and I was at 1 week of camp with the kids, and I got to a point where I could only get out one word at a time, and I just would go into this coughing fit. And I felt horrible. I just kept getting tired, and it was just kind of going bad. So we got back from that. I went another week and a half before I finally went to the doctor because I'm stubborn and I'm stupid. And so I finally went to the doctor, and we go in there, and they run some tests and do all this stuff. And she goes, "How long have you had asthma?" And I was like, well, I don't have asthma. She goes, "Oh no, you got asthma." And I was like, "I do?" And I realized that I'd always been an athlete, I'd always been in really good shape, and so I kind of compensated for my asthma. And so here where I gained 50 pounds, I wasn't in great shape, and all of a sudden this hidden thing in my life came out. And she literally said I had less than 50% airflow through my bronchioles, and if I had gone another week, I was probably going to die. And I remember that moment, and I go, man, I never want to forget this, and I never want to forget how I feel here. And I went on a track. I stopped eating the donuts on Sunday morning. I started running again, got myself running a marathon. I lost all 50 pounds, got my lungs strong. But I always go, man, I never want to forget that. I never want to get back to that place I was at. So what is it that you never want to forget? Here's my second question for you. What changes if you do? What changes if you do? Is it a bad habit that you start back up? Is it someone special that you forget about? Is it a life change that you unchange again? What happens if you forget? See, remembering produces a response. Remembering produces a response. We've been going through the Bible this year. We're using the Bible recap and just looking at the Bible. And I'm always amazed. It doesn't matter how many times I've gone through the Bible, how many times I've read it through, that every time I look at it, every time I read it, there's always something new that I catch. There's always something new that I missed before. There's so much in there. I just look at how big our God is and that I can never remember or catch everything there is about God. And so I've been really blessed right now as we've been going through this. And if you've been doing this with us and you did this week's reading, then you probably felt like it was a little bit deja vu. Anybody with me on that? Like, didn't we just read all of this? Didn't we just do all of this? It was just literally Deuteronomy is Moses' Bible recap. Like he just does a repeat everything that we just read in all the other books to this point. And so in the spirit of Deuteronomy, I want to do a little recap of the recap. Can I do that? Because I don't think you got it enough this week. All right? And so, and it really starts at the very beginning in Genesis. God created the world, right? He created everything in it. The skies, the oceans, the lands, the trees, the birds, the animals. He created mankind. And what's really struck me this time around as I'm reading this, that God designed the world to thrive off of His presence and off of His provision. That when you look at the creation and how it was supposed to work, it was off of His presence and it was off of His provision. And it didn't take long for mankind to forget that. It didn't take long for mankind to go, you know what? I don't trust God's provision and I don't trust His presence. Actually, they stopped trusting His provision and they removed themselves from God's presence. And we kind of know how the story goes, right? Everything gets wrecked at that point. And we get to the point that God has to destroy the earth in a flood and kind of start everything over again. But in the midst of this, God's presence never left. And in fact, God added to not only His presence and His provision, but He added a promise and a plan. And He started fulfilling that promise through a guy by the name of Abraham. He told Abraham, hey, go to this land that I'm going to show you. And it always amazes me that He didn't tell him where the land was and He didn't tell him where to go. He just goes, just start walking and I'll show you along the way. And it was like He was like, hey, Abraham, I just need you to trust in my provision. I need you to trust in my promise. Because He promised Abraham that through you, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And through that nation, I'm going to bless the world. That was the promise to Abraham. And so Abraham didn't have any children until he was well past 100. And he finally had a son, Isaac, in his old age, in his wife's old age. I think she was 100 years old at that point. And she has her first son, Isaac. And then Isaac has twins, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob deceives his brother and steals the blessing. And essentially, he steals God's blessing to Abraham. He steals the promise of God. And through Jacob, he has 12 sons, and they become the nation of Israel. And through a whole lot longer story that hopefully you've been reading with us and you remember it, that they end up in Egypt. They become this great nation down there. They multiply, and then the Egyptians get scared, and they put them into slavery, and now they're slaves in Egypt. And where we just came out of was that God sent Moses, this guy Moses, raises him up to help free the Israelites. And there's a moment in there called the Passover. And it was the night that God says, I'm going to pass over Egypt. And if you have the blood of the lamb over your doorpost, I'm going to pass over and nothing's going to happen to you. And He told the Israelites, be ready for when that happens. Because as soon as that happens, you're going to be free from your slavery. The Egyptians didn't put that over their doorpost. So when God passed over Egypt, He killed the firstborn in Egypt. And they go, we want nothing to do with your God. We can't handle your God. Your God is too big. Get out of here. And so the Israelites take off, and God leads them to the promised land. He leads them to this land that he promised Abraham years and years, hundreds of years before. That God was fulfilling his promise and his plan. And when they got there, they looked at it and go, man, this land is great, except for the people are really big and we're scared. I don't want to go. All of a sudden, people stop trusting in God's presence. And I never quite understand this because God literally was with them. He was in that pillar of cloud and fire by night. And he literally put his dwelling in the tabernacle. We've been reading about all this stuff. God was literally in their midst. And they go, man, God, you're not enough. They didn't trust in his provision. They didn't trust in his promise. And they didn't trust in his plan. So God said, then wander in the desert for 40 years until you die. And this is the moment where we get right now the Israelites, all the Israelites that were slaves in Egypt, that were 20 years and older at that point, they've been 40 years in the desert, they have all passed away now. And now their children and their children's children were getting ready to possess this promised land, this land that God said, I will give you and I will make you into this great nation. And they were getting ready to go in there, and Moses is there. Moses doesn't get to go into the land. And this is one of those things I feel like it's so unfair sometimes because I look at Moses and all the great things he did. But there was a moment as a leader that he didn't trust in God's promise. He didn't trust in God's plan. And he kind of screwed up. And God said, because of that, you don't get to enter into the promised land. And I look at the heavy toll, and this is just more of a side note, just the heavy burden that God places on those that would lead. And I think it is so important for us as a congregation to be praying for Andy and for our elders and those that lead our church. Because there's such a heavy burden to do the right thing, to always follow after God, to always lean into his promises and his plans, and always trust his provision. It's not an easy task. We need to continue to lift them up. But we get here, Moses, he doesn't get to go in, so this is his last message to all the Israelites. He says, you're getting ready to go in and possess this land. This is my last message. And for me, if this is the last thing I get to say to somebody, you're going to say the most important thing. And if you read this week, then you realize all he did was repeat himself over and over and over again about everything else that he's already said. But I look at it and go, that must mean it's important. So we pick up in Deuteronomy 6. And Moses kind of starts this. This is the Shema, and this the Hebrew word here means to listen, but it doesn't just carry this idea of I heard you. It carries an idea that you listen and then you respond. That what I heard causes me to respond. It causes an action from me, and so you've probably heard this before. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart." And in the Hebrew, heart actually carries the idea of mind as well. So when Jesus repeats this in the New Testament, he says heart and mind. It's because the Greek splits it. In the Hebrew, heart and mind are one thing. It's the same word. And so he says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all your mind, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. Then he goes on to say, impress this on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. Essentially, Moses says, listen and respond to the fact that there is no other God like our God. Listen and respond to the fact that God is bigger than anything in this world. God is greater than anything in this world. And make sure your kids know it. It's not enough for you to know it. It's not enough for you to respond, but make sure your kids know it because it's that important. And he says, love the Lord your God. And that love is actually, it's the Hebrew form of agape. If you know agape in the Greek, it means it's a love that you choose. It's a commitment that you're making. It's not based off of feeling. It's not based off of because they did something or you did something. It's because I'm going to choose to love you. It's kind of that same idea that it says because of who God is, you choose to love him with all that you are and with everything that you have. And that's kind of the way Moses starts this whole message. And then he goes on and says this in verse 10. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large, flourishing cities that you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things that you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So Moses goes, God is about to give you everything that he promised. He's about to give you everything that you ever wanted. You're about to be rich beyond compare. You're about to have everything. And by the way, you've done nothing for it. You're about to have everything you ever wanted. And then he gives the number one most used command in the book of Deuteronomy. In this whole speech that Moses gives, he says this 20 times. He says, be careful. Be careful. He says you have two options here. You can take everything that you have for granted. You can take everything that you have and stop paying attention. You can start to believe that you made all this stuff happen for yourself. Or you can take care not to forget where you were. You can take care to not forget who actually controls all of this. You can take care to not forget who is greater than all the things that you actually have. I think most of my life I've been told to be careful. If you know anything about me, it's a fair request. Things tend to happen to me. And here's the thing, I got to thinking about this, because I say this all the time to my wife, is like, I'm not trying to hurt myself, but I'm also not trying not to hurt myself. And there's a difference there. There's a difference between not trying to hurt yourself and just not trying to not hurt yourself. Does that make sense? Like there's a big difference. And I think about when I was in high school, as a kind of a perfect illustration of my life is we were going on a youth trip and we went to Colorado, and we went a few days early so we could play around on the mountains. And so we were there the first day, and we drove up to the Continental Divide around Monarch Pass and everything. And so we took a Jeep trail, we drove up most of the way, and then we hiked up just a little bit to the peak of the mountain. And right there was this huge herd of elk, and it was awesome. It was awesome to watch them. Well, they saw us, and they took off running, and like idiots, we were like, let's go follow them. And so we're like, okay. And I don't know if you know this, if you've ever hiked a mountain. If you haven't, I want to give you a little piece of advice. You go down a lot faster than you go up. So we were walking what seemed like just a few minutes, not much more than it took us to walk up, except for when we looked over, we realized, man, we had come down a really long ways. And those elk were nowhere to be found. And so we got to looking around, and our truck was literally like right across from us. And so we had two choices. Go back up to the top of the peak of the mountain and then come back down, and that was going to take like a long time and a lot of effort, or we just walked straight across. Only problem is the mountainside's covered in snow. It's early June. And the guides we had, they said, whatever you do, don't walk on the snow. It's melting. There's caverns underneath of it. You never know when you're actually going to walk and just fall through, and you can fall off a cliff that you didn't even know was there. Or you're going to hit a piece of ice. It's super dangerous to walk on the snow in this melting period and stuff. And so we're standing there. Our youth pastor, he's like 21, 22, 20. You guys don't know anything at that age. No offense. I was the same way. And so he was like, well, I'll just go and I'll cut whole paths across, and we'll go ahead and cross it. And so we were like, okay, sounds great. And so he does. He's got a stick, and he's checking it, and he's cutting whole paths, and he actually makes it all the way across, and he's like, all right, it's safe, come on over. And it's about 100 yards. It was about 100 yards that we had to go. And so we all start going, and there was a girl that was with us. Every problem in life starts with a girl. You guys laughed at that one? Oh, man. Oh, you weren't supposed to do that. So girl was going, and I was behind her, and she was like, kept slipping and screaming and all this stuff. And so I was, going to be the nice guy, right? I was looking for a date that week, all right? So I decided I'm going to go underneath, and I'm going to cut my own footpaths so I can catch her if she ever falls, right? So I'm the type of guy I am. And so we go on, and I'm cutting footpaths and everything, and I'm being real careful, right? Because they said, be careful when you're going across the snow. Well, we'd gotten about halfway there, and man, I'm cutting footpaths like a champ. This was not hard at all. It seemed super safe. And so I kind of let my guard down. Kind of go, it's not any big deal. And so I went to go cut this footpath. And when I put my foot in, I put all my weight in there before I'd actually, knocked a hole. And I hit a large chunk of ice. And so my foot didn't go into the snow. I slipped and I fell. And I literally caught the foothold above me with my hand. And we were on a slope that was about like this. It was like super steep. And so I was slipping as I was holding on. That girl was like, and stuff. And I thought, it's just snow. Like, I'm from Kansas. This shouldn't be bad. It's like sledding, right? Because we know what's... Okay, yeah, you get it. And so I looked up at her. I gave her a wink, and I let go. And whew, I just took off. About lost my head at the same time. No, I took off, and I was like, oh no, I just made the biggest mistake of my life. And so I flipped over, I dug my hands into the snow, I put my feet into the snow because that's going to slow me down and stop me. It did not. I just kept getting faster. I was cutting these like big troughs through the snow and just picking up speed. And I went for about 300 yards down this mountain on the snow, and then the snow stopped. Yeah. And then it was just nothing but rocks and boulders. And so I'm bouncing off of it like I'm in a pinball machine and everything. And I was like, I've got to get myself up before I die here. So I slammed my hands down and I popped myself up, except for I'm going so fast now. I was getting ready to flip over and start doing somersaults down the mountain. So I start running as hard as I can. And then bam, became an instant tree hugger. Hit a tree, knocked me out. And I was so far down that mountain, I twisted my ankle, I busted my hip, I was in a bad way. Do you ever feel like life is that way sometimes? You think you got it figured out? You let your guard down? Moses says, be careful. In other words, he says, be intentional. I think that's what he's saying. He's saying, be intentional about what you're doing. And he goes on to say this, and this is kind of the first part of his repeat in Deuteronomy 8. He says this. He says, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to anger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on the very word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. And so Moses starts with the second most used command in the book of Deuteronomy. I believe he uses this 19 times. Be careful was 20 times. Remember was 19 times. Be careful to remember. Be intentional to remember. He says, we have two choices here. Forget how we got all of this. Forget how we got here. Forget where we were. Forget that we were in slavery. Forget that life was not real great. Forget how we got to this good spot and this good place. Or be intentional about remembering who God is. That God is ever present. That God always provides. That God's plan is always in motion, and he always fulfills his promise. Verse 7 through 9. He says, "For the Lord your God is bringing you into this good land, a land with brooks and streams, deep springs gushing out into the valleys and the hills, land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, the honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills." This always reminds me of the first time I went to a buffet as a teenager. Like my parents paid, God, how much money, I don't know, didn't care. I got to walk in and it was like, oh, food to my heart's delight. I can have as many places I want? Yes, right? As a teenager walking in there and 10 plates later, I am just like, oh my goodness, like this is the greatest day of my life. I picture that in this moment that God's like, you're about to have everything that you ever wanted. There's going to be more than you could ever want. But he says, don't forget that God is doing this. It is God who is bringing you into this land. It's the very presence of God. It's the very provision of God. It's the very promise of God. It is the very plan of God. Be intentional. Be careful not to forget. Be intentional to remember. And then it says, verse 10, "When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he's given you. Be careful," there it is again, "be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God." I don't ever remember thanking my parents for paying for that buffet. I think Moses is saying here, man, when you've experienced that God's plan is good, when you experience that God fulfills his promise, when you experience that God has provided, as he has for the last 40 years, when you've experienced the presence of God, do not forget. Be careful. Do not forget and praise the Lord. Your remembrance demands a response. Remembering leads to a response. It's a response of worship. To love your God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your mind. You have two responses. Love yourself. Take pride in yourself. You go, oh, look how much money I have. Look at this house I have. Look at my yard. It's so beautiful. Look at the car I get to drive. Look at my family and how great they are. Look at all the stuff that they have accomplished. Look how great I am. We have this thing that to start worshiping ourselves, to let pride be our God. Or worship God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. He goes on to say, "Otherwise, when the herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You may say to yourself, my power and my strength of my hands has produced this wealth for me. But remember," there it is again, "remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. So confirms his covenant, his promise, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today, his plan. If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify you today that you will surely be destroyed." Whether we triumph in life or we fail, comes to how we respond when God provides. We're either going to remember that it was God or we're going to take pride in our own self. And Moses is telling the Israelites, you're getting ready to have everything you ever wanted. What are you going to remember? Will you remember your slavery? Will you remember the freedom that you were given? Or are you going to start trusting in yourself? And I think he was kind of even leaning into, you've experienced the failure of getting this wrong for the last 40 years. And you have a chance to triumph going forward. Why did Moses repeat things so many times? Because I think it was important. So he goes, this is a matter of how your life is going to go. Are you going to live a life of worship? Or are you going to live a life of want? See, our remembering leads us to a response. And that response is meant to be a response of worship to God. We don't worship to appease God. We don't worship to check off the boxes. We don't come here to go, okay, I went to church today. We don't do the sacraments to go, okay, I checked that off the box today. I read my Bible recap today. Check that off the box. We don't do it to appease God. God does not need us. God doesn't need us to do anything. It is because that God is the one who provides. It is God who does it for us. We do all of this not to appease, not out of obligation, but as a response for who God is. It's a response for living in the presence of God. I'm always blown away how God can fulfill His plan and His promises in the present while also continue to work on it in the future. And there's a moment in time where He says, my presence is going to be with the people of Israel. My presence is going to be with the people of Israel. And people are going to know me, know my presence, know my provision, know my promises and my plan through this nation of Israel. And a couple thousand years later, He sent Jesus. And God says, my presence is now going to be with Him. And Jesus is going to live among us. And because Jesus lives among us, because of what Jesus was going to do, His presence was going to be with us, the whole world. That He was fulfilling His promise to Abraham, that through Abraham, all the world would become blessed. While God was fulfilling His promise to this group of people in the desert, He was ultimately fulfilling His promise to us. We're going to do something a little bit different today. The servers are going to start coming out here with communion. And I don't want you to take it. I just want you to hold on to it. We're going to take it together here in a moment. But I was looking at this and I realized that I think sometimes we forget what this was all about. That when Jesus was, the night before He was crucified, the night before He was to fulfill God's plan and His promise to the whole world, He was with His disciples and they were celebrating the Passover. And I believe the Passover is like this is the ultimate reminder of God's story and our story. It was the ultimate reminder that we live in slavery to our mistakes. It's the ultimate reminder that we live in bondage to the places where we mess up. And it's the ultimate reminder that God is the one who provides us a way out. It's ultimately that God provides us the way out of that. And so Jesus is sitting with His disciples and He takes the bread and he says, God has provided for you. God has come here and He's provided for you in me. And then He takes the juice and He says, God fulfills His promise of redeeming you, of setting you free, of bringing you into the promised land. That God fulfills His promise through the blood I'm about to shed. And He says, when you take this cup, you're going to do this now in remembrance of me. It's so easy to come in and go, man, I checked off the box that I took the bread and I took the juice and I checked that off my box. I did something for God today. No, I believe this was meant. I think Jesus meant this with His disciples. He goes, I need you to remember. You need to be careful. You need to be intentional about remembering that God provides. And God fulfills his promises. And it demands a response from us of worship. We don't take this out of obligation. We take this as a response. A response of remembering. So it can lead us into a life of worship and a life of lifting God higher than anything that we have in our possession, higher than anything that we might put our hope in, that God would be the one that we put our ultimate hope in, that we'd always be the one in front of us. So Jesus took the bread and he said, "This is my body." He says, God has provided for you in the presence of Jesus. Do this in remembrance of me in my broken body on the cross. In the same way, he took the cup. He said, "This is my blood. This is my blood." This is the promise of God. That when he looks at us, he doesn't see our failures. He doesn't see where we've messed up. He sees the blood of the Lamb. He sees the blood of Jesus. He says, "This is my blood that I'm about to pour out on the cross." So that when God passes over, that when God is in your presence, that's what he sees. He sees the beautiful, perfect, shed blood of the perfect Lamb. Do this in remembrance of me. Remember and respond. I'm going to invite you to look at the maybe a little bit different than you have before. That because we remember who Jesus is, that we remember the presence of God in our life, that we remember the provision of God in our life, that we remember the promise of God in our life, that we remember the plan of God, that would lead us to a response of worship. So let's stand and let's worship our God who's bigger and grander than anything that we could ever imagine.